Apple in China, the capture of the world's greatest company by Patrick McGee. Apple in China, the capture of the world's greatest company is a deeply researched and compelling narrative that explores Apple's complex, evolving, and increasingly fraught relationship with China, drawing from over 200 interviews with former executives, engineers, and insiders, as well as internal memos, emails, and previously unreported meetings, especially those involving Steve Jobs. Author Patrick McGee tells the story of how Apple became both a driver and a victim of China's rise as a global manufacturing powerhouse. The Rise of Apple in China. The book begins with Apple's early struggles to scale production outside of the US, particularly in Europe and Asia. As demand for the iPhone exploded in the late 2000s, Apple found itself lured by China's seemingly endless supply of cheap labor, government-backed infrastructure, and an aggressive push to become the world's electronics assembly hub. Companies like Foxconn were able to offer Apple the speed, scale, and cost efficiency it needed to meet global demand for its revolutionary products. Apple responded by pouring billions into building an intricate, highly sophisticated supply chain across China. It sent thousands of engineers to live and work alongside Chinese manufacturers, trained millions of workers, and invested heavily in local suppliers. These efforts allowed Apple to produce the most iconic consumer tech products of the 21st century in staggering volume and at massive profit margins. Unintended consequences. However, what Apple didn't foresee was that this deep entanglement would come with long-term consequences. By investing so heavily in China's industrial base, Apple inadvertently helped build a world-class electronics manufacturing ecosystem. What began as a transactional partnership evolved into a strategic dependency. Over time, the very capabilities Apple helped develop enabled China not only to support its own domestic tech industry, but also to gain leverage over Apple itself. McGee reveals how Apple's technological transfers and operational expertise contributed to the rise of Chinese competitors such as Huawei and Xiaomi. As Beijing began to assert more control over its tech sector and over foreign companies operating within its borders, Apple found itself increasingly constrained by political pressures, regulatory demands, and nationalistic policies. Inside Apple's China strategy, the book delves into the behind-the-scenes maneuvering within Apple as it tried to navigate the complexities of doing business in China. It profiles key figures who played pivotal roles in Apple's expansion on the mainland. The Mormon missionary, a little-known figure who was instrumental in establishing Apple stores in China and understanding the cultural nuances necessary for success in the market. The Gang of Eight, a group of top Apple executives tasked with managing relations with the Chinese government, balancing Cupertino's values with Beijing's expectations. An idealistic veteran, an executive who sought to improve working conditions in Apple's supplier factories, only to be thwarted by both corporate cost-cutting pressures and China's crackdown on civil society under President Xi Jinping. These personal stories illustrate the moral compromises, operational challenges, and geopolitical tensions that have defined Apple's presence in China. From rebel to reluctant collaborator, one of the central themes of the book is the transformation of Apple from a company that once celebrated rebels and troublemakers in its famous Think Different campaign to one that has had to acquiesce to authoritarian demands in order to protect its market access and profits. McGee doesn't shy away from the contradictions in Apple's public image versus its private actions, such as complying with Chinese censorship laws, storing user data on servers controlled by Chinese entities, and removing apps deemed sensitive by the regime. This evolution is portrayed as a gradual but inevitable outcome of Apple's economic dependence on China. The company, once proud of its independence and innovation, now finds itself in a precarious position, too big to leave, yet increasingly vulnerable to political coercion. Conclusion: Apple in China is a cautionary tale about globalization, corporate strategy, and the unintended consequences of outsourcing critical industries. It shows how even the most powerful and innovative companies can become ensnared in geopolitical realities they helped create. For readers familiar with Walter Isaacson's Steve Jobs or Chris Miller's Chip War, this book offers a revelatory and sometimes disturbing look at how Apple's pursuit of efficiency and profit led to a dependency that now threatens its autonomy and perhaps even its identity. In the end, Apple's story in China is not just about one company. It reflects broader shifts in the global economy and the growing influence of authoritarian states in shaping the future of technology and trade.